For a long time, she believed God was part of the solution, but not enough on his own. She trusted him, but also trusted herself to fill the gaps. She prayed, but carried backup plans in her heart. She believed, but kept her hands tightly wrapped around outcomes she feared to release. God was present, but so was striving. She didn't notice it at first. It felt responsible, wise even. After all, faith didn't mean being careless, right? Trust didn't mean letting go completely, did it? So she added herself to the equation, her effort, her vigilance, her anxiety disguised as preparation, her control disguised as wisdom, and slowly, without realizing it, she began living as if God needed her help to keep everything from falling apart. She loved God deeply. She followed him sincerely. But deep inside, she was exhausted, not because God demanded too much, but because she never allowed him to be enough. There is a quiet heaviness that comes from trying to supplement grace, from adding strength where surrender is needed, from holding on to what God asks us to place entirely in his hands. And she felt that weight in the way her prayers became anxious, in the way her peace depended on circumstances, in the way her rest felt conditional, in the way fear crept in. Whenever outcomes felt uncertain, she trusted God, but only alongside her own efforts. Until one day, she reached the edge of her strength. Not dramatically, not loudly, but honestly. She realized she was tired of managing faith instead of living it, tired of believing in God while still acting as if everything depended on her, tired of carrying what grace was meant to hold. And in that quiet realization, a holy question surfaced in her heart. What if God is enough without my additions? What if his faithfulness does not require my constant vigilance? What if his sovereignty does not need my anxiety to function? What if his love is sufficient, even when I stop trying to secure everything? Letting God be enough was not about giving up responsibility. It was about releasing illusion. The illusion that she had to complete God. The illusion that peace required control. The illusion that faith worked better when fear stayed close. And in that moment, she didn't lose faith. She deepened it. If you've ever loved God, but felt worn down by the need to hold everything together, if you've ever trusted him while still carrying the weight alone, if you've ever wondered what it would feel like to truly let God be enough, stay. This message is for the woman who is ready to stop adding herself to grace and finally rest in the sufficiency of God. And if these words already feel like relief, like truth settling into place, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when it needs the reminder that God does not need to be supplemented. He is already enough. Now, let's walk through what changes when she finally lets him be. She never meant to replace God. She only tried to assist him. It happened in subtle ways, ways that looked faithful on the surface, but slowly drained her spirit underneath. She prayed, but then replayed every possible outcome in her mind, as if vigilance could guarantee peace. She trusted, but still prepared herself for disappointment, but believing that expecting less would hurt less. She surrendered, but only partially, holding back the things she feared. God might handle differently than she hoped. She didn't call it control. She called it responsibility. She didn't recognize it as fear. She saw it as wisdom. But beneath it all was a quiet belief. She rarely admitted even to herself, what if God doesn't come through the way I need him to? So, she stayed alert, ready, guarded. She learned to carry faith, with tension in her shoulders and knots in her stomach. She learned to believe in God, while still believing she had to protect herself from the unknown. And that tension became normal. Normal to wake up already worried, Normal to pray and then spiral. Normal to say, I trust God, while still rehearsing backup plans. She loved God, that was never in question. But love mixed with fear creates exhaustion, because trusting God halfway still requires carrying the other half alone. God watched her gently, not disappointed, not impatient, but waiting. Waiting for the moment she would notice the weight she was carrying was not coming from him. He never asked her to manage outcomes. He never required her to anticipate every possible failure. He never asked her to guard her heart with anxiety. Those were additions she made herself, not because she was unfaithful, but because she was afraid. Afraid of loss, afraid of pain, afraid of surrendering control to a God whose ways she could not predict. But faith is not built on predictability. It is built on trust, and trust cannot coexist with the need to supplement God. Slowly, she began to see the pattern. Every time she tried to help God, she lost peace. Every time she tried to stay in control, she felt heavier. Every time she added her fear to faith, rest slipped away. She began to realize that the anxiety she lived with was not the price of obedience. It was the cost of mistrust, not loud mistrust, not rebellious mistrust, but quiet mistrust that says, I believe you, God, but I don't know if you're enough on your own. That realization did not shame her. It humbled her, because she saw something clearly. For the first time, God never asked to be assisted. He asked to be trusted, and trusting him fully meant releasing the parts of life she kept trying to manage, with fear disguised as faith. This was the first crack in the wall she built around her heart. Not a collapse, but an opening where peace could finally begin to enter again. Beneath every attempt to supplement God, there was fear. Not loud fear, not obvious fear, but the quiet kind. The kind that dresses itself as caution, as preparedness, as wisdom. It whispered to her, in moments she least expected, what if this doesn't work out? What if you get hurt again? What if you trust too much? What if God allows something you wouldn't choose for yourself? So she stayed alert. She told herself she was being realistic. She said she was simply protecting her heart. She believed she was learning from the past. But God saw what fear was doing beneath the surface. Fear kept her calculating. Fear kept her bracing for impact. Fear kept her from fully resting in the goodness she believed God had. She trusted God's character, but feared his methods. She believed in his love, but questioned his timing. She knew he was faithful, but struggled to believe that his ways would feel safe to her. And so, she tried to stay one step ahead. She anticipated pain, so it wouldn't surprise her. She limited hope, so disappointment wouldn't devastate her. She kept part of her heart guarded, so surrender wouldn't cost too much. But fear is a poor guardian. It promises protection, but delivers exhaustion. It claims to keep us safe, but keeps us tense. It pretends to help us cope, but quietly steals peace. God did not condemn her fear. He understood where it came from wounds that taught her to be careful, from prayers that went unanswered longer than expected, from seasons where trusting fully seemed to lead to pain. He knew her heart wasn't hardened, it was cautious, and God is patient with cautious hearts. He didn't rush her into surrender. He didn't force her to let go. He invited her to notice what fear was costing her. Fear was costing her rest. Fear was costing her joy. Fear was costing her freedom. And slowly, God began showing her a different truth. She didn't need control to be safe. She needed trust. Not trust that nothing would go wrong. Not trust that life would be painless, but trust that whatever came, God would be enough. Enough to sustain her, enough to guide her, enough to comfort her, enough to redeem even what she feared. Letting God be enough meant allowing Him to be sufficient not only in outcomes, but in uncertainty. It meant believing that His presence was more secure than her precautions. And as she faced the fear beneath her need to control, she realized something tender. God was not asking her to trust blindly. He was asking her to trust relationally, to trust the way a child trusts, not because she understands everything, but because she knows who is holding her. And for the first time, that fear began to loosen, not disappear, but loosen. Because fear cannot dominate a heart. That is learning to let God be enough. There came a moment, not dramatic, not emotional, when she simply grew tired of carrying faith with tension, tired of praying, and then worrying, tired of trusting, and then controlling, tired of believing in God while still bracing for disappointment. She realized that her faith had become crowded with her fear, crowded with her plans, crowded with her constant vigilance, crowded with the pressure to make sure everything turned out okay. Grace was present, but it wasn't alone, and grace was never meant to share space with fear. So she began doing something new, not bigger prayers, not stronger declarations, not deeper explanations. She began letting go. She let go of the need to anticipate every outcome. She let go of the habit of replaying worst-case scenarios. She let go of the belief that peace required constant alertness. This release was quiet, almost unnoticeable. No one around her saw it. There was no visible change, no announcement, no breakthrough moment. But inside her, something shifted. She stopped adding herself to grace. She stopped finishing God's sentences, stopped managing His timing, stopped trying to predict His ways, stopped correcting His silence. She allowed God to be complete, and in doing so, she discovered something she had forgotten. Grace works best when it stands alone. Grace does not need reinforcement. It does not need supervision. It does not need fear to keep it functioning. Grace is sufficient because God is sufficient. As she released control, she felt lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because everything was no longer hers to resolve. Her prayers changed. They became simpler, more honest, less frantic, more trusting. She prayed without rehearsing outcomes. She waited without panicking. She moved forward without needing guarantees. This did not make her careless. It made her free. She realized that faith is not strengthened by adding effort. It is deepened by removing fear. And the more she stepped back, the more room God had to step forward. Not because He was absent before, but because she had finally stopped standing in the way with her anxious striving. Letting God be enough did not mean life suddenly made sense. It meant she no longer needed it to. She had found rest, not in answers, but in sufficiency, and that was enough. As she let God be enough, she noticed something unexpected. Her life didn't become smaller. It became steadier. She had feared that releasing control would lead to chaos, that trusting fully would leave her exposed, that resting in God's sufficiency would somehow make her careless or passive. But the opposite happened. She became calmer in moments that once overwhelmed her. She became slower to panic and quicker to pray. She became less reactive and more rooted. Trust began to replace tension. She no longer felt the need to have everything figured out before taking the next step. She no longer measured her faith by how prepared she felt. She no longer equated peace with certainty. She discovered that peace came from presence, from knowing that God was near, not because she managed things well, but because He promised to be. Her faith matured, not into something louder, but something deeper, not more demanding, but more settled. She learned that letting God be enough did not mean she stopped caring. It meant she stopped carrying. She still made decisions. She still showed up. She still loved deeply, but she no longer lived, as if everything depended on her performance. She allowed God to hold the outcomes, and in that surrender, she felt safer than she ever had, while trying to control everything, because trust did not remove uncertainty. It removed isolation. She was no longer alone with her fears, no longer alone with her questions, no longer alone with the weight of responsibility. God was no longer an addition to her efforts. He was the foundation. And once he became the foundation, everything else found its place. Her heart learned what her mind had long known. God does not need to be supplemented. He does not need assistance. He does not need fear to make his plans work. He is enough. And when she let him be, she finally felt free. In the end, what changed her life was not a new strategy, nor stronger discipline, nor greater effort. It was trust, the quiet, humble decision to stop adding herself to grace and let God be enough. She realized that God had never asked her to complete him. He asked her to come to him, to trust him, to rest in him, to believe that his presence was sufficient even when answers were not. Letting God be enough did not remove every challenge, but it removed the need to face them alone. It did not make life predictable, but it made it held. It did not eliminate fear, but it placed fear in the presence of a faithful God. And that changed everything. If this message spoke to you, if you've been loving God, but living tired, believing yet burdened, trusting yet still holding everything together, let this be your reminder. You are not required to supplement grace. You are not asked to finish what God began. You are not meant to carry what he already holds. If you want a place to return when your faith feels heavy and your heart needs rest, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey. Because the God who called you is already enough, and you are allowed to live like it.